Good morning, Dan and Amy. So, Iran and Russia are still who we thought they were. Iran firing another missile yesterday, according to U.S. intelligence officials who confided with Fox News on the topic. When the missile used in Wednesday's launch, short-range Marsad surface-to-air missile, which impacted 35 miles away, according to that said U.S. official. This in response, at least in part, to new sanctions imposed by the Trump administration earlier after a previous missile launch in violation of this unholy deal that was forged by the Obama administration. Where does the relationship with Iran go? Where does the relationship with Russia go? Got an update on story of another victim of Putin's authoritarianism. But to help us with this discussion, enlighten us, we're pleased to be joined by former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Ambassador Bolton, thanks for being with us again. Appreciate it.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So on Iran, the criticism of Iran missile launch and new sanctions, another missile launch, where is this trending?
Well, I think we're moving toward some kind of confrontation with Iran. I think there are a number of other things that we're going to see in the next few days, very likely. And I think everybody should remember that Trump said during the campaign he thought this was a terrible deal. He hasn't actually ended it yet from the U.S. perspective, but I think when National Security Advisor Mike Flynn said last week that Iran should be on notice about our view of their behavior, purportedly compliant with the deal, that they're being told that they're within a heartbeat of the deal disappearing. And there's reporting yesterday that the White House is considering putting the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps on the list of foreign terrorist organizations, frankly, something that should have been done about 10 years ago or more, which would have a dramatic effect because the Revolutionary Guards, in addition to being the Ayatollah's tip of the spear throughout the Middle East, a funder and armor of terrorism, possessor of the nuclear weapons program, also are big business people in Iran. So this designation would have very far-reaching impact, and I think we're at the point we should tear the deal up anyway, and we'll see what happens then.
Well, why isn't he tearing up the deal? I mean, I know that you're waiting for Mike Flynn, but what's holding him up? I mean, you did mention he campaigned on that, but some people want action now, especially if they're testing these long-range missiles.
Well, the State Department institutionally is just all a Twitter over this thing. I mean, my goodness, tearing up this deal, they spent 4 years negotiating. But the fact is, it was a strategic mistake for the United States. It's not getting any better with age. Look at the way Iran has acted for the last year and a half, continuing support for terrorism, threatening international shipping in the Red Sea, on and on and on. If this is the way they behave when they don't have nuclear weapons, imagine what happens when they get them. So I think the case is overwhelming to tear the deal up and to get serious. This deal put us in a very difficult position. It's given Iran another year and a half to advance its ballistic missile and nuclear weapons programs. And I think when Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel comes here next week, what to do about the Iranian nuclear weapons program is going to be right at the top of the list. We don't have good options. We didn't have good options before this deal. And Obama just a year and a half ago, gave the Iranians the greatest gift that somebody can give a would-be nuclear weapons state, and that's more time. The more time to perfect their program, to develop their weapon, to research and test their ballistic missiles for delivery purposes, and Iran has taken full advantage of it.
Not the only regime to be generous to Iran. Also, Putin in Russia has been allied with Iran on matters like the construction of a nuclear reactor there. And yesterday, a opponent of Putin's, Alexei Navalny, who was seen as kind of a prominent, young, reform-minded presidential opponent of Putin's when he's expected to run again for election, in quotation marks, in 2018, next year. he was convicted on very dubious embezzlement charges, and which would kind of sideline him from in pursuit of the Russian presidency. What of and no tweets or word from Trump on this matter. What of Putin's repression of political opponents and journalists and regime critics, and the Trump administration's posture towards Putin in those areas of human rights and small d democracy?
Well, we don't know yet, really. We've had statements and tweets and the like, but we don't really know what the policy is. We know that there's a coming clash between, I think, overwhelming majorities of the House and the Senate and perhaps the administration on the subject of the economic sanctions imposed over Russian military activity in Ukraine. I think the Navalny conviction and the general re-authoritarianizing of Russia that Putin's been engaged in is something that that the administration is going to have to deal with. It goes beyond whether two leaders get along with each other, especially when you consider that this increasingly authoritarian society has taken Iran's side in the conflict in Syria against ISIS, on the Iranian nuclear weapons program, and I just think there's tension in the views we've heard. Trump being very strongly against the Iranian deal, but hoping for good relations with Russia. I think those things are going to prove out to be impossible because Putin's pursuing Russian national interests as he sees it, and those interests in the Middle East and on Iran and Eastern Europe are just directly contrary to America's as I see them.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, they're going to be mutually exclusive at some point. I mean, they are fundamentally already. Maybe we're not there rhetorically. It'll be interesting to hear from Secretary of State Tillerson on this issue, some of his first pronouncements. But the Wall Street Journal opined on this. Many of the Trump supporters are suggesting he's engaging or trying to engage Putin the way that Reagan did Gorbachev. And the Wall Street Journal is quick to point out, yeah, well, Reagan was quick to speak up and speak out against the Soviet Union's human rights violations, and likely would have in the case of this conviction yesterday and the other silencing of critics, in addition to, oh, by the way, not being afraid to refer to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. So it seemed like Reagan had a bit more of a nuanced approach that was rooted in peace through strength, not peace through compliment, the exchange of bon mots, as Trump has done with Putin thus far.
Well, I think personal relationships among leaders obviously can have an important place, but they don't substitute for national interest. They certainly don't in Putin's case. And I think one thing to keep in mind here is that when you see a country like Russia treating its own citizens the way they've treated Navalny, the way you've seen journalists executed, that's the only word for it, opposition politicians as well, how do you think they're going to treat foreign investors when push comes to shove? I don't understand the fascination of American oil companies and a lot of other companies to rush to put large capital investments in those kinds of places when we don't have any assurance that they're going to be treated fairly. I'd apply the same point to China, where I think a lot of people are very concerned about the way the Chinese interfere in the economy and discriminate against foreigners. I think Russia's clearly demonstrated a propensity to do that already. So, this is it's always the case in early days in a new administration. You see a lot of possibilities that are worth looking at, maybe worth pursuing, but don't have any long-term faith that they're necessarily going to pan out, because ultimately, as good presidents, great presidents since George Washington have recognized in foreign affairs, what drives nations are their interests. And interests trump personal relationships, no pun intended.
Yeah. So before the Super Bowl, of course, President Trump, I don't know why I have a hard time saying that. President Trump sat down with Bill O'Reilly and pretty much appeared to equate U.S. actions with the authoritarian regime of Russian President Vladimir Putin. What was your reaction when you heard that interview?
Well, I was very surprised by it. I just don't think you should equate the actions of the United States with those of Russia. And American presidents have been naive about Russian and Soviet leaders for a long time, including Franklin Roosevelt, who said after being briefed about what Stalin's intentions were take over countries in Eastern Europe after World War II. He said, I have a hunch Stalin's not that kind of man.
Mm-hmm.
I think if I give him everything that he wants and ask nothing in return, then noblesse oblige, after the war he won't annex anything, and he'll work with me for peace and democracy. Now, that has to rate as the silliest thing said by an American president in the 20th century. And that attitude cost us a lot, cost our friends a lot in the aftermath of World War II. I'm not opposed to trying to get along with a foreign leader. I just think you've got to be very cold-blooded about this.
An excellent cautionary tale. He is John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the UN, now a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Ambassador Bolton, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Always glad to do it. Thanks for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's like a hot, steaming cup of information to start your day. It's Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.